I've joked already, and in fact several times, about the somewhat strange name for this, our next functional group and course for the 70-411. This one titled File and Print Services, or Configure File and Print Services. Now, the joke was that for a functional group titled File and Print Services, there aren't actually any tasks that at least I can find that speak directly to the print half of File and Print Services. Now, whether this is conspiracy or admitted just oversight on Microsoft's part, I think one of the reasons why they term this particular functional group File and Print Services has a lot to do with this Part 1, Part 2 approach that we've talked already about, having to do with the 410 versus the 411. Now, back in the 410, we had a similarly named functional group, also called something on the order of File and Print Services, that gave equal attention to both the file half and the print half. And so one argues that probably what Microsoft intends to do is to just continue that naming scheme here with the things that we have to know for the 411. And so it is here in this course that we'll continue that conversation and focus then on some more of these, actually in some cases, very interesting technologies that Microsoft can bring to bear that are free because they're in the operating system, that can make your file services just that much more available, that much more useful, and that much more usable. Now, if you're just joining us, this is our learning path here for the 70-411 exam. This course is number 5 in our series of 7 different courses making up the content for the 70-411. We began with a look at the MCSA and where this exam sits in the greater scheme of certification as it relates to Microsoft. And then from there, we dug into the variety of courses broken up by functional groups that define the different technologies the 411 requires us to know. So beginning with deploying, managing, and maintaining servers, continuing in with the remote access role and configuring network services and access. We then, back in that immediately previous course, talked about Active Directory, and with that Active Directory already built from the 7410 content, we then went through some additional configurations to add automations and just make it work all that much better. We'll continue that theme of adding and extending from what we learned in the 410 here in this course and functional group titled Configure File and Print Services. Now, what are we going to talk about? What are the topics that you need to know when you're going through the configuration of your file services and maybe print services as well? Here in this course, we have 4 different topics and 4 different technologies that Microsoft adds over the top of your usual NT file shares that you're used to making available through a drive letter or through some / server name / share name. Here in this course, we'll talk about replicating that content. So taking the content that exists in one location and making it available in another through a technology called distributed file system. DFS is a pretty slick little solution that you can use when you need to have multiple copies of data that exist in multiple different locations. And what's great about the DFS of today in comparison with previous generation solutions is that today's DFS is one you probably really would want to use in production if that was indeed the use case you need to resolve. DFS can, in much different from some older technologies, actually go about creating that multiple different location scenario that you would potentially want to use in a production sense. Now, anytime you're dealing with your file servers, anytime you're dealing with the content on those file servers, you've got some additional tasks that are really hard to do if you try to accomplish them manually. These are things like defining quotas. These are things like preventing certain files from getting on systems. These are things like creating reports of just the content that exists on your file servers. And so our second topic here has to do with the File Server Resource Manager, which is one of the unsung heroes of the file server role, because FSRM is one of those tools you honestly don't see implemented in a lot of locations. However, it is a really useful tool if you need to just simply know, and also in some cases control, what is on your file servers. I think you'll enjoy what we'll go through here because some of the things that FSRM brings to bear really ease that otherwise difficult problem of trying to figure out and then remove the stuff you don't want, and also constrain your users from just simply eating up all the disk space that you have available. Now, we can't get through any conversation on files and file content without talking a bit about encryption and protecting those files against prying eyes. Here in our third topic on file and disk encryption, we will talk about exactly that, both the file encryption side and the entire disk encryption side as well. That's the BitLocker technology that Microsoft has built into Windows. Both of these can be used for different use cases. If you need to just encrypt single files on a disk, you could use EFS to do that, the encrypting file system. If you needed, however, to encrypt the entire disk, we could do so with the BitLocker technology. We will actually use BitLocker for a use case that you probably wouldn't necessarily expect until you start to think about exactly why this particular use case exists. Back in that last course, we were talking about Active Directory and the read-only domain controller role. And I told you that one of the big reasons why you use RODCs is the fear, the possibility that someone could abscond with your domain controller and then all your usernames and passwords. Well, an RODC helps you in those situations by only having a certain set of usernames and passwords in that location. But you can further protect that RODC, just the same way you would a file server, by turning on BitLocker for that system. What that means is if the bad guy does take off with your RODC, well, they're not going to get very far because they would need to then decrypt the entire disk in order to get at those usernames and passwords. These three then take us to our fourth topic, which is to configure advanced audit policies. And I'll freely admit that some of the things we've talked about or will talk about here in advanced audit policies are things that we probably already discussed back in the 410 content, but there are a couple of additional just nifty things that you can turn on that we'll talk about here in this fourth module. It's definitely one not to miss, particularly if you are responsible for ensuring the security status of the different machines under your purview. So let's get started then on the file half of file and print services. Coming up next will be our first look here at DFS, the Distributed File System, and DFS in both of its different iterations, DFS namespaces and DFS replication. I've already kind of pitched a bit about the replication part of DFS, in that DFSR allows you to take a copy of content and make it somewhere else, and potentially more than somewhere else. Well, in this module, we'll talk not only about the replication part of it, but also the DFS-N component, DFS namespaces. When you have users that need to access the variety of content that exists on all your file servers, wouldn't it be easier if you had a single location where people could go that is essentially a link of links to help them get to the proper location without incurring a lot of brain damage? DFSN supports that, connecting users into the appropriate location, and then DFSR allows us to just spread that content to the various locations that we may have. This fairly extended conversation on DFS in both of its flavors is a topic for our next module coming up.